Hello, welcome to this video showing you how to get started using Gibraltar software with MVC. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new project. We'll pick an MVC3 web application and we'll pick the internet application because that gives us some code to work with. You've probably already got an application in place in which you want to plug Gibraltar. Now we're using Visual Studio 2010 here, but this works equally well with Visual Studio 2012 and MVC4. Now we have our application created, we need to add Gibraltar. There's two ways to do this. You can do it the old way using add references, or the better way is to simply use NuGet. So what we'll do is install package Gibraltar.agent, and that will install the Gibraltar libraries and do any other modifications necessary. So that's done that. Let's have a look at what this has done. That's added two references, the first to Gibraltar.agent, which is the library which actually sort of generates and keeps all of that logging information, and then the packager which sends all of those log informations up to the Gibraltar hub. We've also modified web.config, and that adds a new section, Gibraltar, with all of the configuration that we've needed. Now I'm actually going to do one change here which you don't need to do, but that's just to modify a connection string to point to my existing database. Now that we've got Gibraltar installed, we need to hook into the pipeline. One of the things you really want to do is trap and log unhandled exceptions, so when some exception goes wrong that you're not expecting. Now MVC3 has a system for that already. It's part of the filter pipeline, but what we need to do is we need to sort of hook into that system. So what we're going to do is we're going to just add a folder called logging, and within that we're going to add a class. And we'll call this Gibraltar error logger attribute. And we're going to inherit this from handle error attribute, which is one of the standard MVC3 attributes for handling errors. And within this we want to override onException. And the onException is raised when an unhandled exception happens. So we now want to log an exception. So we're going to say record exception. And we need to pass in the exception details, and that's stored on the filter context. And we're going to also pass in a category so that we can filter on this later if we need to. So we'll call this unhandled exception. And we're also going to say whether or not the application continue from this exception. In this case we don't know, so we're going to say yes, it can continue. So that's our filter. That's all we have to do. We just now have to log and record our exception, but we need to plug this into the pipeline. So I'm just going to copy the attribute name and go to global ASAX, and you can see we've got register global filters, and within that we're adding a filter called handle error attribute. That's the default behavior and the default logging, but we want to do the same thing. So we're going to say filters dot add new Gibraltar attribute, and make sure we bring in the reference. So now we've got our attribute in place, and what we'll actually do is we'll just copy out the default one so that the only thing in place is our one. Now that's all you have to do really at the very minimum to get working with Gibraltar, but we're actually going to start or tell Gibraltar when something has started and when the application has stopped. So what we're going to say is Gibraltar.agent.log.start session. Now it's important to realize that session here in terms of Gibraltar means a logging session, not an ASP.NET session or a web browsing session. You know, they're two very different things. So we want our session to be for the whole application. So we're also going to add application end, so we can tell Gibraltar when the session has ended. End session. So now Gibraltar knows when the session has started and when the session has ended. And we're also going to trap unhandled errors. So anything unhandled will happen through Gibraltar now, or it won't happen anything. It won't affect any of the other pipeline, but it will also be logged by Gibraltar. So we need to create something that's unhandled. So the simplest way to do this is the good old divide by zero application exception. So now when we go to the about action, we're going to get a divide by zero. But what we also meant to do is we also want to potentially log other details, such as just tracing information or information. So let's have a look at our account controller. And there are a couple of places where you can see you might want to sort of record some information. When someone's logging on, we've got a failure state. Username or password is incorrect. We might want to log that to potentially see if people are trying to hack into this. So we can say gibraltar.agent.log.warning. And there's a number of overloads to this, but we're going to pick the bottom one, category. We're going to call this authentication. The caption we'll say authentication failed, and now we want a description. So we're going to say authentication failed for user, and we want the username, so we're going to pull that from the model.username. So that's just logging a warning with Gibraltar, and notice that the message follows the string format option, so you can put placeholders in and then have any number of arguments after that. The other place where we could also do this sort of thing is when people are registering. If there's some sort of registration failure, we might want to register when that happens. We'll leave that one out for the moment. So let's compile this and run it. So the first thing we want to do is we'll go to about, and there we've got our unhandled exceptions. We've got our divide by zero. So now nothing's showing up in the application, and that's fine because that's not what we're expecting. Gibraltar is a logging application, so we'll look later how we sort of access those logs. And let's try logging on, and we'll just pick a name and any old password because it doesn't really matter. So login was unsuccessful. So you can see that that's our model error, which matches up with the model error here, and then after that model error is set, we'll have logged that details. So what we now need to do is work out how we actually view all of this information that we've been logging. The way we actually analyze and get the details of all this logging is to use Gibraltar Analyst. So if I call this up, what you'll see is that I've got my local sessions, and these are sessions which are local to me, and you can see ASP.NET, and within that I have one session. So this is one application cycle. It tells me the version details, which I could have set these up with Gibraltar to log those sort of details. When the session started, when it ended, how many messages there were, and whether there were critical and warning messages. So if I click on that session, what you'll see at the bottom is the details of the machine, so when it started, ended, the culture, the time zone, etc. And that can be useful for debugging. But to get the more details, we want to drill into this session, so we double click. And that will show us all of the session details that have been loaded and all of the tracing that Gibraltar has done. So we have a list of all of that tracing. So we can see that the session started. We can see where that session was started. We explicitly started that. And because we're running in debug mode, we actually have sort of the trace stack with us. We can see all of the assemblies that were loaded. We can see our exception. We can see attempt to divide by zero. Where it happened in the about action. The category was unhandled exception, so that's something we can filter on if we need to. We've got the stack or we've got the actual source code, and if we wanted to see the application stack trace, we can, and that's pulled out of the exception. So that's the unhandled exception. But what about the warning? Well, the warning you can see here, authentication failed. There was no exception, so we don't get anything in the exception window, but we get the log message, authentication failed for user Dave, and it picked out that username out of the model. And once again, we also get the logging information, the source code, because we've got that. And then when the session ended, which is when the application ended, we get the session end. So that's a full stack of details of our entire application end to end, showing all of the default logging that Gibraltar does, plus unhandled exceptions in MVC3, as well as standard logging. So you can see that you've got an enormous amount of information available simply just by putting in a few lines of code. And the more tracing that you put in, the more information you have about how your application is working. Now, there are a lot more details that you can get out of Gibraltar, both in the individual session view and in the main view, but we'll be covering those in later videos. Thanks for listening.